I'm Diana Fuentes. I'm on the FOIFT board, and I want to welcome you all to our afternoon panel here. And we're talking primarily today, we're very proud to have a very good panel of award-winning journalists today that are going to talk to us about their experiences and give us some tips on what to do when you run into stonewalls, when you're reporting and you come into these agencies or these people that aren't giving you the information that they ought to be giving you. So let me give you just a quick bio here. Jaie Avila has been an investigative reporter in San Antonio at OAI, Channel 4, for 17 years or so. He's won Emmys, and he was a reporter before then in Los Angeles, Austin, and Phoenix, where he was named AP Reporter of the Year for an investigation into food stamp fraud. In San Antonio, he's had a bunch of really good stories that have made some major impacts over there, including one, school officials stealing from their districts, and that resulted in prosecution. The city had to rewrite its towing ordinance and cut inflated towing prices. And there was another one where the changes had to be made to speed up response time to 9/11 calls. Many more stories than that. John Tedesco is an investigative reporter at the Houston Chronicle, and before that he worked at the San Antonio Express News. And so he's been 20 years doing investigative work also. And he also has had a bunch of award-winning stories. One of the most recent one, the project Unfair Burden, in which there were thousands of public records that he had to go through, him and his team, to expose the flaws of a $10 billion economic incentive program the state was doing. And as a result of that one, the legislature decided not to fund that project again. There was also an instance where he was part of a lawsuit where they had to sue the city of San Antonio, the police department, to release its use of force reports. That also came out with a lot of really good stories of that. And there's more than that, too. Lexi Churchill is another really great investigative reporter, and she's right now on the ProPublica Texas Tribune investigative unit, and she's been instrumental in some other reports that have had dramatic results. She and others worked on a story that had to do with failures in first responder policies that led to the worst carbon monoxide poisonings right after the result of Winter Storm Uri. And then also one story that I thought was really interesting was this quiet crackdown on Medicaid procedures in Idaho that prevented kids with special needs and some of the state's poorest residents from getting and keeping their health insurance. All of these are really important investigative stories that rely, of course, on public records. And so we're going to get into that today. And what do you do when you run into a stone wall that won't give you the information you need to go? So let's start off with some experiences. Jaie, can you give us a couple of cases you've had?
Absolutely. I wanted to talk first of all about, we had a very bad year for government transparency in 2020. It was awful. Along with the pandemic happening, you just were not able to get a window into government the way that we could prior to that. And a big reason for that, and this was worked on in the most recent legislative session, was that from the hurricane a few years ago, they passed a law that would allow government agencies to basically have a reprieve from open records law if they filed a catastrophe notice or if they claimed that they were on skeleton staffing. And so this was intended for a hurricane-like event, a catastrophe where they physically could not get to their computers, couldn't get to their office, the office was flooded or something, and so naturally they would need some time away from answering requests. But instead, when the emergency orders came out during the pandemic, you had government agencies month after month claiming that they were still in a state where they needed the catastrophe notice, where they were still on skeleton staff. And so you ran into relatively routine open records requests where you couldn't get the simplest of information, and their answer was just, well, we're on skeleton staff, they'll just have to wait. Never mind the fact that they were working with full capability from home, and they had access to their computers, their databases, fellow employees. They were doing everything else, but open records is just one of the things they could get rid of during the pandemic, so many agencies did so. So one example that I was going to bring up and how we were able to circumvent them putting up barriers like that was really a very simple story when we were, everyone was going back to school a little more than a year ago, and families were very anxious about what kind of protections will be there for my child, what kind of PPE will be used, what kind of barriers will be there, what kind of distancing. They just didn't know what to expect if they chose to send their children back for in-person instruction. So my assignment was pretty cut and dry, just to reach out to the different districts, put out a request for information on how much they spent on PPE, specifically what kinds of things they were going to have and spend all that money on, and to be able to tell where that money came from to purchase it. And many of the districts, they responded quickly. It was easy for them. It was a relatively low hurdle. I had one school district that just gave me the PowerPoint that they had recently given to their school board. And that was good enough because it was recent, up-to-date information on what they were buying. But the San Antonio Independent School District was one of those agencies that just decided for many, many months to not respond to any open records requests. And so I couldn't get this simple purchasing information from them about PPE. And tried to explain like I usually do and sent emails, that this is kind of pretty simple stuff. But they were pretty set in their ways that they just weren't going to deal with open records. And so eventually, after just a lot of thinking about it, and that's sometimes what you have to do, is just take a step back and think, how else could I find a way around this obstacle? And in this instance, I remembered that they had recently had their longtime public information officer had left. And while this district had always had kind of a contentious relationship with the news media, she was very professional and she was good and she knew open records law and knew what she had to provide. And so even though she was retired, I still had a number for her, and I reached out to her and talked to her about what was going on. And as I remember, though, I don't even think it was even a conversation. I think it was just an email. And she was savvy enough to understand right away that this was not something that they should be holding out on. And so I'm not exactly sure what happened on the other end. It probably was just as simple as her getting through to whoever was temporarily or put in charge, interim, in charge of public records. But all of a sudden I get an email with the information that I wanted from the public records request. So sometimes it's just thinking back and remembering a former staff member, maybe somebody who was once the public information officer, once the records custodian or records administrator, and now they've moved on to another department. I know there are some people who are in recent retirement that we kept in touch with in case we need to reach out to them for help in certain agencies. So that's one way that you can get around an obstacle like that, kind of using resources that are people, that are human, to try and get around that. Another way is to search for pressure points and to actually do stories on what you're encountering, to publicize the fact that they are not providing the records that you've asked for. A specific instance that I can remember is when we did the story on the 911 system in San Antonio for answering calls. An employee had tipped me off to an important statistic about dropped calls, that many of these calls are abandoned calls, I guess was the term. That many of the calls coming in, I think it was a fifth of the calls coming into the 911 center were abandoned calls. In other words, on hold so long that nobody ever picked them up. And so we started looking into that and got a Stonewall from the police department. And I even wanted some further records that I knew they had from previous years, where an audit had revealed this problem, and it was 10 years prior, they could have fixed it. And so I was after those records. And so in that instance, we were denied an interview, we were denied exactly what we were looking for as far as the records were concerned. And so we went to city council members and started interviewing them individually. And, once again, you've got people who are facing elections, so they have to be accountable to the voters, and so that's a pressure point for you. You look for the person who perhaps is going to have to be accountable and be out there in the public and face this question at public meetings and things like that. So your council members, one time we reached out to both of our city-owned utilities, SAWS and CPS Energy, have board members and board meetings. And you reach out to those board members can sometimes be a resource to put pressure on staff to release the records. And so these are options for you. In the case of the police department, after we interviewed a couple of the council members, word trickled back to the brass at the police department that we were doing that, and at the very last minute, they made the chief available with the information that we wanted. And we went ahead and were able to do the story, but it took the extra effort to think of who we could contact elected officials wise. So that was the portion I wanted to point out. Think about how you can apply some pressure or how you can find somebody behind the scenes to be your ally to get the records.
Thank you, Jay. John, nursing homes?
Yeah, kind of to follow up on Jay's point, writing about a roadblock is something that journalists can do, and something citizens can do. So I'm going to talk about some tips about how to go about doing that and what kind of benefits come about from these kinds of stories. So a really good example of this happened last year during the pandemic. There was a lot of public interest in the number of COVID cases at nursing homes in Texas. And Texas health officials were keeping track of this information, but they weren't releasing it. So this left a lot of families in the dark, and they couldn't get answers, that affected their loved ones. And they weren't sure which nursing homes had hotspots, how nursing homes compared to others. They couldn't make informed decisions. So in early April of 2020, I sent the state, I requested a copy of any data that the state had showing the names and locations of nursing homes and how many COVID cases they had. I wasn't asking for the names of residents, I was just, looking for the numbers. So I remember getting a response back from the Health and Human Services Commission, and they sent a letter to the AG arguing that this stuff should be confidential. And this letter had like 24 other requesters CC'd on it at the bottom. So I saw that and I kind of realized, I went to my boss and I said, there's a lot of interest in this, and this is starting to feel like a news story, and she agreed. Sometimes that's a hard sell with editors. We don't like to write about ourselves as journalists, we don't like to put ourselves in news stories, and so, you might encounter some pushback when you pitch this stuff. I think there is another way to look at these stories. If you're trying to get information about something and you can't answer questions for your readers or your audience because an agency is withholding records from you, it's totally legitimate to tell people about that. You're being transparent about a lack of transparency. And it's just another way to inform people about what the government is doing, which is what journalists do all the time. And this can be just a few sentences in a story. It doesn't have to be a whole full-blown article in and of itself. It can just be a few lines explaining why you couldn't find out something. And there's a few benefits of doing this. First of all, you're keeping people informed, which is our job. You might encounter a quick fix. What Jay was saying about talking to board members and stuff. Once you start working on a story or publishing a story about the problem, wiser heads might prevail, and the agency might change its mind and release this stuff. And the big picture benefit, the long-term benefit, is that your story might help improve the Public Information Act. Lawmakers pay attention to these kinds of stories. This is how they learn about problems with transparency in Texas. And so it's actually a pretty common way for the law to get fixed. And it strengthens the law and makes it better for everybody. And that's actually what happened in the case of this nursing home episode. There were multiple news organizations that wrote about the fact that Texas was not releasing this. The AG eventually ruled in our favor, but also lawmakers acted. You know, they were aware of the problem. Senator Zaffarini wrote a bill that flat out says this information is open to the public, and now we have a better law. So a few tips about how to work on these stories and what to think about when you want to inform people about a problem with an agency. Step one, call Kelly Shannon, because we're in Texas, and you know, the foundation is the go-to organization for open records issues. And she's a good sounding board. She'll give you good quotes. She'll refer you to open records experts who can offer more perspective. You know, sometimes you might be really pissed off that you're not getting something you want, but maybe the agency has a solid legal reason for doing what they're doing. So they're just a good third-party, you know, resource to talk to. In this case with the nursing homes, Kelly had actually written an open letter arguing for the release of this data. So that part really helped strengthen our story about what the state is doing. Find the agencies that are doing it right. Texas was citing HIPAA as one of the reasons why this data cannot be released. Meanwhile, federal officials were planning to release and eventually did release their own version of nursing home data showing COVID cases at every facility. So they had no qualms whatsoever about HIPAA, and they eventually did release this data. So that helped strengthen our story. Talking to lawmakers can help. Texas was citing some state statutes in an attempt to withhold this data. My colleague Jaie Avila, he lives in Austin. He covers the ledge, and he was like, let me call some of these lawmakers who actually wrote these laws that are being cited. And sure enough, they said there was nothing in the statute that prohibited the release of what we were looking for. So again, that really helped our story when we wrote about it. And talking to the people who were impacted by the lack of transparency is really important. In this case, there were family members who were, you know, they viewed it as their job to protect their loved ones, and they felt like they couldn't do their job. They didn't have the right information to do their job. And so we definitely quoted them, and that was another thing that helped our stories. When you do this, you know, all these elements come together and help answer the so what question for your audience. Why should the average person care that an agency is not being forthcoming with something? And so when you pull those elements together, your story is stronger, and it also might help strengthen the Public Information Act.
That's good. Thank you, John. Lexi?
Yeah, so as Diana mentioned earlier, I'm a part of a very unique team that's a collaboration between the Texas Tribune and ProPublica, which is a national nonprofit investigative newsroom. And we actually got started in March of 2020, which was a bit of a curve. And, you know, we were coming into what Jaie was describing with all of those limitations as sort of the base environment of what we were looking into. So in order to do a lot of the public records-based reporting that we wanted to do, we had to learn a lot of these tricks that we're talking about. So because we work for the Texas Tribune and ProPublica, we are often reporting on statewide issues, so the scope of our reporting is often broad and sweeping. And a lot of times when that comes to public records, that means we're asking for maybe the same type of record from all the major metropolitan areas, maybe concentrated geographically depending on what the event is. And I found through doing that, and that being sort of a requirement of a lot of the reporting that we do, the responses I often get from asking for the exact same type of record from multiple different agencies, cities, counties, that sort of thing, sort of fall into a three-tier system as I like to think of them. The first is always the first most helpful agency that will respond, maybe give you a call, hey, I just want to clarify what you're looking for. Yes, we can do this. They'll get it to you first, no questions asked. The second, you know, you might have to follow up a little bit, have a conversation about it, you know, remind them a few times, but they'll ultimately be helpful if you kind of help them along yourself. And then the third, which is what my colleagues have talked about, where you're meeting a lot of resistance, you know, maybe you have to file a complaint, that sort of thing. So I have discovered this sort of system and tried to use it to my advantage when I'm dealing with situations like that, where some responders are being more helpful than others, by sort of leveraging that first more helpful response to try to compel the other sort of responders to do the same. So early on, one of the first stories we did was about the uneven enforcement of the statewide COVID regulations that had been put in place at the end of March of 2020. And we were requesting this data from a bunch of different cities, I think maybe the most dozen populous or so throughout the state. And San Antonio actually was the first city to put this data online, the so-called enforcement data. And it was super accessible. They were updating it every day. It had all the sort of categories of information you would want, from addresses to who was violating which law and all that sort of thing. So it was really easy to download that and send it to other cities and be like, hey, this is exactly what I'm looking for. Can you provide me this information? And I found that especially helpful with something like that that's sort of a new record or a new type of data that a city or a county or an agency is collecting that the FOIA officer may not even know of themselves at that point, since it's so new. And one of the things we ran into, San Antonio ended up being the easiest, but a lot of the other cities had multiple agencies collecting the data all at once, and they weren't pulling it all together. So we were going to fire, police, code, like several different agencies just to get the full look of one city's data. And of course, even within the agencies, they were keeping it differently and had different information, as the decentralized system of Texas just always goes FOIA-wise. But that was incredibly helpful to start with a solid data set to be able to point to and say, look, they're already releasing this. They have address data in there. They have the offender names in there, so to speak. Can you do the same from your records? Another story that this came super in handy for was when we were reporting on the aftermath of Hurricane Uri, in what ended up being our story about how the storm elicited the biggest carbon monoxide poisoning event in recent history. And at the beginning of that reporting, we were looking for a lot of basic emergency response information to just see what we could see. And so we were a lot of times requesting a lot of 911 call logs, various fire and police records, that sort of thing, just to start by getting ideas. And Austin's EMS department ended up being the most helpful in that situation. I got a call from their chief, who was handling a lot of the FOIAs, probably the same day immediately, told me about sort of an interim record we hadn't even thought of, that was kind of between, it's basically a transcript of a 911 call. It's called a CAD report. And that saved us a lot of time from going to just requesting the 911 call logs, which had super basic information about addresses, dates, and that sort of thing, to then, instead of requesting all of the 911 audio we wanted for all of those calls, we had sort of an intermittent step to see and get more information there. So not only was he helpful in telling us about a new record we didn't know about, but they were really quick in getting us back those records. And they also included the address information, which ended up being sort of a contentious issue for some other cities and counties. So I believe it was the city of Houston that was going to send my request to the AG, and the same day I sent them the data that Austin had already sent me, and within a matter of hours they withdrew their request for the request to the AG, and I think I ended up getting the data back in a day or so, which was shocking and amazing, and a seemingly rare victory that we don't get to celebrate very often. So yeah, I would encourage you, if there are multiple different agencies or school districts or whatever it is that you're wanting to request the same records from, being able to point to something that one of them has already given you even if they're just trying to fight you on a specific part of that, like the address information or date of birth or something like that. It can be super helpful, and I feel like takes a bit of relief off of their shoulders to be like, oh, I don't need to do a extensive legal research of why I may not need to cite an exemption because someone else has already released the same information. Another tip that we discovered in sort of more along what Jay was saying of going to various people that may be able to get you the same information. We were doing a story about a local elected official and his relationship with this outside company that was trying to sell the county some sketchy at-home COVID tests before that was a thing at all back in last summer. And we were requesting a bunch of email records between that official, which should be totally public information, and the company and the various people within the company. And we happened to come across a disgruntled, you could say, employee within that body. And we know that employees on the inside obviously have better access to information than what we do, but I had not realized, and I'm still not totally sure how widespread this is, but I'd encourage you to find out in whatever locality you're covering, that in that particular system, the employees had the ability to internally request information the way that we go through FOIA, but the difference for them was that it was a lot faster and the results were unredacted, which was very nice. So we were able to get that information a lot faster than if we went through the normal FOIA channel, which we still did to cover our tracks, but I would highly encourage you, if you have some friends on the inside, to see if they have those powers that be.
That's pretty good. And that brings up, that's a good point. The records that you're talking about from the pandemic, about the violations, that actually came about because the media got together in San Antonio, and we all met with the city PIO because there were a lot of information, and we actually sat down and told them what we wanted. And that helped because instead of being flooded, or they felt, instead of being flooded, we all got together and sat in the TV stations and the print and the online and radio and asked for that. And they said, okay, we'll get it for you. And sure enough, I mean, I don't think it took them a week to start providing that information online. So sometimes it helps if you all get together wherever you are and ask for something together. There is power when you're together. But so let's move on to tips, individual tips. Jay, do you want to start? You said about you said you're going to talk about the people in charge, right? When you go to,
Sure.
You've got to keep an eye out on who's in charge of the records.
Yeah, it's been talked about a little bit already, but you know, every agency has, most agencies have a records administrator or custodian of records. Sometimes in the smaller agencies, they don't, but there's somebody in IT that knows the inner workings of how certain data is kept, especially the more technical you get. They need IT staff who can do that. And so I want to take a step back first and say that I remember when I first started doing this kind of reporting, and this can happen a lot with reporters or with those that we're working with at the government agency, is that because there's this rule in open records law that the agencies aren't allowed to ask you why you want the information. And so because of that rule, which is appropriate, but it creates this weird, awkward dance, you know, where you're talking to people on the other end and they're scared to ask you certain things to clarify the request, and you're a little nervous about giving them too much information. So I try and dispel that, because it really is important to have a relationship with people who are in those agencies and who can help you, and then you can help them by not causing a lot of extra work for them and not having to come back time and time again to get what you want to get. So what I mean by this is I have on several occasions when I kind of hit a brick wall because I requested something and it came back and it said there's no such record, or we don't have that information, but I knew that something along those lines existed. Then I just talked to the public information officer as a courtesy and said, I'd like to request off-the-record phone meeting. You can sit in on it if you like, with the records administrator or with the IT person, whoever knows these records the best, who's going to be able to help you and I get to the bottom of this. And they usually always agree to that. And so I've had conversations with, I'm trying to think of an example, a good example. For example, there's a very small department of just a few people that handles all the towing and the impound of vehicles in San Antonio. It's away from the police department. It's not really a part of that whole machinery downtown. And so I couldn't get the information I was looking for that was kept in some sort of database I knew. And so I asked for a phone conversation with a PIO downtown, and then the two people who were relevant there at the scene. And I was able to ask them, okay, how is this kind of information kept? Do you keep this kind of thing? What would I call that? What's the term? What's the form? Just these real basic granular questions that will help you craft an open records request that, again, will make less work for you, less work for them. And so sometimes they're taken aback a little bit because they're not used to reporters wanting to know the inner workings of how documents are kept. But most of them realize these are the people's documents, the people's information, the people's data. And so in the interest of transparency, there's nothing secretive there. Now, in some cases, you can't contact someone like that. Now, there's an agency that I know of that will not allow that kind of thing. And so one thing you can do is you can take a step back and say, and put in an open records request for every form that is used in a certain process to get a certain action by that government agency. I want to know, I want a blank copy of all those forms that are involved in the process. And then you wait for those to come back and you see what kind of information is gathered, and now you've got the correct forms to ask for and the terminology to use, things like that. So that's one good way to kind of take the mystery away from this open records process. Get to know people. At the city of San Antonio, there is someone in the city attorney's office who basically sends all the requests to the attorney general's office, or eventually gets us the documents that we have asked for. And I try not to bother him too much, but I can call him up and say, what am I running into here? And he can be, depending on the individual, sometimes they can be very frank. Well, this is what we have, and what you have, we can't release it because there's this kind of data in it that we don't think is public. And so it may turn out that you don't need that piece of data that they are withholding the whole record, because that one thing, somebody's personal email address that you don't want, but it's in there in that record. And so what's beautiful with is if, and most agencies are working with Excel spreadsheets where you can just say, you can say in your request, take that field out of there and give me the rest, or you can modify your requests in that way. So those are different, ideas of approaching this, getting to know the records administrator, custodian of records, IT people, have a discussion with them off the record, and then you can find out exactly what you're dealing with.
Thank you, Jay. John, how about talking about the AG's office, kind of things they might be able to help with?
Yeah, it's interesting hearing Jay and Lexi talk about this, because what we're kind of doing is we're educating, in a way, agencies that might not be aware of what they're supposed to be doing in some cases. It's interesting, like it's a negotiation, and Jay's right, like the law says we don't have to explain why we want something. But I just went through this the other week. I was requesting something from an agency, and the agency was really pushing back on this, and they were right in the fact that they would have to redact a whole bunch of stuff in this document, but it seemed like, there were some things they could release, and also I knew the document existed, so I had to ask for it. So I didn't have to tell them this, but I was like, look guys, I'm just trying to be as thorough as possible and do a good job. I know this thing exists because you referred to it in this other document you gave me, so I'm just, running all the traps and making this request. And it resulted in, kind of a compromise where they gave me pretty much what I was looking for, and it resolved the issue. So I think it helps open doors just to be forthcoming and talk about stuff. If you do hit an impasse, like let's say an agency is just completely shutting you down, I do think the AG's open records hotline can be effective. If, going back to the educating part of an agency, like if an agency for whatever reason is not complying with the law, like maybe they're telling you like, we don't have to give this up, or we don't have to seek an AG ruling, or something uninformed like that, you can go to the AG's website, fill out a complaint form online, tell them which agency you're dealing with, the contact person, details of what's going on. The AG will contact the agency and usually set them straight. And it's just a nice way to have this official third party step in and kind of resolve this issue. So I do think that's a good resource for people who are being frustrated in the open records process. I got other little random tidbits.
I think they're good.
One thing that bugs me is you usually hear people say, you'll send a request and the agency will say, well, we have 10 days to respond. No, that's a myth. That's a complete myth. You have 10 days, they have 10 days to notify the AG that they're going to request a ruling. The law says they're supposed to respond promptly within a reasonable amount of time, if that's possible. And that's under, I wrote this down, of course I can't find it, but I put it in my request, all my open records requests, I say, this is under 552.221, and it's not a surefire way to make them hurry up, but it's just a little thing, these are all little things you can do to maybe tip the scales in your favor, right? So if you're afraid that they're going to be taking a long time, you can add that language in your request. And that section also says that they're supposed to certify when they're going to respond with the records. And so it's pretty gratifying. Sometimes you'll get a response from somebody saying, okay, we're going to we're going to reply by Friday or whatever. And it's like, okay, you read that little section in my letter. Awesome. Let's see. Oh yeah, if they do seek an AG ruling, you're allowed to weigh in with the AG and send them a letter and make your own argument why something should be released. And now I'm in the habit of just doing that pretty much with everything. Sometimes our lawyers will get involved with that if it's a really important request. Sometimes I'll just do it myself, especially if it's like something basic, like for example, under the law, 552.022 lays out clear-cut examples of records that are public, and so things like government expenditures are usually, obviously public records, and so if it's something like that, I'll just make a point to, I just want to remind the AG, like, in this part of the law, it explicitly says this stuff is public. So I think, again, small little things you can do to help tip the scales in your favor and get the records you're looking for.
Don't cuss when you write the letter.
Yeah, that's bad. Don't do that.
Though it's hard.
As much as you want to.
It's hard to resist.
Lexi, you were going to talk about anticipate the pushback, I think, and setting your own deadlines.
Yeah, and I really can't overemphasize what John and Jaie said about connecting with the FOIA officer as early as you can. It will solve probably 75% of the issues you have if you just connect with the person that's actually handling your request at the beginning. And along the same lines of what John was getting at with putting that language in the initial request to start off with, I do the same in various ways as well, in terms of trying to anticipate what problems and what pushback I'm going to get about a specific request, whether it's based on the scope of the request, if I know I'm asking for what's going to come back as thousands or hundreds of emails or something like that. With police reports, this was being talked about in a lot of panels, earlier, a lot of times agencies don't have to release them to you if the investigation is still ongoing, if there's I can't remember what it was called, dead clause loophole, or if the investigation didn't end in prosecution, essentially, which can happen a lot of time with in custody deaths or suicides, and it's being cited a lot more. But there is AG language that requires that agency to still release basic information to you from that report. So every time I'm requesting a police report now, I automatically put that language in, like, okay, even if you're gonna send this to the AG to exempt most of this, these are the categories of information you owe me no matter what. And I find that saves me a lot of time in terms of putting it up front, so I'm not waiting for that AG letter 2 weeks later and then asking for it and then going through the hoops again. It's a big time saver. Another thing that I ran into a lot throughout the pandemic when I was trying to get death data or death records is that in Texas you cannot get the death certificates. And every time you ask for death information, a FOIA officer thinks you're asking for the death certificate. But you can actually get other information that is technically from the death certificate, but not the actual death certificate. You can get data from DSHS, the Department of State Health Services, but you can also get something called a summary death index from counties. They're required to keep track of those that have basic information about every person that's died within their jurisdiction, including name, sex, or gender, and a few other things, date of death, I believe. So when I'm requesting those type of records, and then of course the medical examiner records as well, but whenever I'm requesting the death records, and this came from the practice of asking so many times and people constantly citing that I can't get the death record, the death certificate, and me pushing back saying, I'm not asking for the death certificate, I finally just put that language in there, clearly stating, just to be clear, I am not asking for the death certificate. Here is what information I'm asking for. Look at this part of the law. Let me know if you have any questions. And that saves a lot of time as well. Just puts the clarification out there from the beginning. Another thing, I also tried to set up off-the-record calls with the FOIA officers, or especially when I know that they're not the ones actually handling a request, I strongly push to talk to the IT person that is. A lot of times when you're asking for sort of a data extract or a larger email request, the FOIA officer does not really understand the IT limitations of it, and they will just come back to you with a $10,000 bill that you don't want to see. So before you get to that point, ask to talk to the IT person to see what their capabilities are for what you're asking for. For example, the governor's office can very easily pull all of the emails between all of their emails of all the employees in the office. However, the local El Paso Police Department has to go inbox by inbox to get any emails. So you can't really ask for an agency-wide sort of request in that way. So understanding that from the beginning will help you tailor your request to understand what you can actually ask for that's going to be reasonable for them to process on their end. And then lastly, as John was getting at, they don't have a real timeline for when they actually have to provide you the information once they give you an initial response. So I try my best to set sort of internal deadlines between me and that FOIA officer, even if it's just, okay, can you get me the initial cost estimate or the initial whatever by the end of the week? And then once we're getting to that point of them actually providing me information, sometimes I ask for them in batches if it's going to take a while. Sometimes, they say they can't release anything for another month. Okay, well, I'm going to check in every week to make sure we're on track then. Because I have found if a FOIA request is not my top priority, it is certainly not theirs. Especially in the cases like Jay was describing, where this is not their full-time job, they're juggling dozens of other requests. They don't really care if you don't care. So create your spreadsheet, write down every time you check in on a request that's going to take a while, set a calendar invite for the next time you have to check in, stay organized, because it's the only way you're going to get back some of these requests. It is a huge rarity that I send off a FOIA and magically get something back in my inbox without anything happening in between.